It's a great honor and privilege for me to be addressing the Tolkien Society. So thank you so much indeed for inviting me. I'd like to thank Sean and the committee. It means a great deal to me because I first read The Lord of the Rings when I was 12 or 13 in this edition, rather tattered now, and then quickly joined the Tolkien Society. In fact, one of the early issues of Amon Hen has a letter I wrote as a tender teenager, thinking I'd discovered a new Tolkien poem. Of course, I hadn't, but it was I was getting a sense of the canon and variety and breadth of Tolkien's work. And of course, then I did A-level English, and people weren't very interested in Tolkien. But I thought, when I go to university, people will be interested there. But sadly, they weren't, even though it was Tolkien's own alma mater. And such was the lack of interest in Tolkien that the Oxfam shop on St. Giles was selling Tolkien letters. Such was my lack of funds, I couldn't buy them. I was a very impoverished graduate student. But I wish I bought them now, put it like that. So I wasn't able to study Tolkien at university, and when I became a university lecturer, no, you can't teach Tolkien. But eventually, as I progressed through a career, I thought, why can't I? Why can't we have a course on Tolkien and Middle-earth? And indeed looking perhaps at Tolkien's Anglo-Saxon researches, his medieval researches, his whole achievement. And so rather sort of small beginnings at Bristol University as part of a course on English identity, and then becoming a full-scale course at the University of Exeter, and then in summer school, I realized I could actually make a difference. And we launched the course and it ran successfully for several years, and I'm now teaching it at the University of Macau, which is a special administrative region of China, which means I have to get up at 2:30 in the morning to teach classes this semester. But the students are very enthusiastic, they're very well informed, and they're very committed, and it's really wonderful to see an international dimension to Tolkien studies. So that's sort of part of my background, really. And I wanted to share with you some of the things that I've been discovering about Tolkien's work, particularly because I'm just finishing a book, which will be published in September, called 21st Century Tolkien, What Middle-earth Means to Us Today. And this talk has a rather vainglorious title of 10 things you never perhaps knew about The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. I say perhaps, that perhaps is really important because I worry that what I'm going to say will appear as what Gollum might have said as chestnuts. You know, somebody who's lived under the misty mountains for centuries would probably know everything I'm about to say. So if that's the case, I do apologize. But I'll just give you a hint of what I'm not going to talk about. You perhaps already know that in 1930, Tolkien recorded 2 little excerpts for a lingophone record. Yes, I can see people nodding already. At the tobacconists and the wireless. So I'm not going to talk about that because you clearly know about that already. Neither will I talk about the Beatles wanting to star in a version of The Lord of the Rings. I've been actually doing a bit of research on this. It's quite a garbled and murky story. I think the actual truth of this matter is a little bit more complicated than most of us might actually recognize. But I'm hoping to just cover it in a little detail in the book in September. So I'm going to start somewhere else. I'm going to start at the beginning, if you like, the beginning of The Hobbit. And what Gandalf says. Within 2 or 3 pages of The Hobbit beginning, we have Gandalf arriving, and Gandalf plays language games. Good morning. Do you wish me a good morning, or mean that it's a good morning whether I want it or not? Or that you feel good this morning, or that it is a morning to be good on? Or that you want to get rid of me, and it won't be good till I move off? 5 interpretations of good morning. Now, this reminds me of somebody. It reminds me of Humpty Dumpty in Through the Looking Glass. When Humpty Dumpty, glory, that's a good knockdown word for you. Or impenetrability. Impenetrability means we've had enough of that subject, and it would be just as well if you'd mention what you mean to do next, as I suppose you don't mean to stop here for the rest of your life. Now, Alice says quite reasonably, that's a lot of work for one word to do. Humpty Dumpty says, well, when I make the word do that amount of work, I always pay it extra. Now, what I'm suggesting to you that Humpty Dumpty is in a power struggle with words. He wants to have mastery. Who is to be master? That is all that matters towards Humpty Dumpty. Which is quite the opposite to Tolkien. Tolkien's a philologist. He's being led by words through history, through meaning, through their different contexts and allusions. But at the same time, words are clearly very powerful in Tolkien's works. They have power over life and death, quite literally in the Riddle Game. The Riddle Game is about finding the right word, which will either mean that Bilbo can escape, or we eat Sid. Or words can gain entrance to the mines of Moria, for example. Or words can actually condemn an oathbreaker to an undead existence for centuries. So there is something similar about the language games and the power of words between Humpty Dumpty and Tolkien's attitude. And I would suggest that Gandalf, I know this sounds bizarre, Gandalf is a Humpty Dumpty character. He's a Humpty Dumpty character who breaks in to Bilbo's world and challenges it with language. In Through the Looking Glass, Humpty Dumpty also offers a reading of Jabberwocky, that strange poem, "'Twas brillig, and the slithy toes did gyre and gimble in the wabe," a poem that Tolkien quotes more than once. He quotes it, for example, in the Beowulf lecture, the monsters and the critics. So, Through the Looking Glass and Jabberwocky and Humpty Dumpty are quite close to Tolkien's heart. And what does Humpty Dumpty do next? He sings a nonsense song. Well, nonsense songs punctuate The Hobbit, and also, in fact, The Lord of the Rings. You know, whether it's a washing up song, or the elves in Rivendell, or the goblins in Goblin Town. And what else does Humpty Dumpty tell us about? The unbirthday present. Who else gives presents when it's not their birthday? Well, the Hobbits actually gives presents on their birthday to everybody else. There's a sort of strange comparison here. And more generally, you get the sense of Alice as she travels through this strange, weird, exotic landscape. It's rather like Bilbo when he leaves Bag End. He's going across this different terrain. It's something which is unexpected and incongruous and unfamiliar. And of course, Tolkien himself, when he saw the blurb for The Hobbit, comparing it with Alice in Wonderland, he said, no, it's more like Through the Looking Glass. So maybe we should be sort of thinking more about the connections here between something like Through the Looking Glass and the Hobbit. We're going to move a little bit on in The Hobbit now to the moment where the dwarves sing their song and the Tookish part of Bilbo wakes up and he begins to dream about having an adventure. And yet the Baggins part reasserts itself, and he makes a noise of a whistle, like an engine coming out of a tunnel. And then he says, struck by lightning, struck by lightning. And that's all he says for a while until he calms down. Why did he say struck by lightning? Why does he say it? Well, Carl Jung, in The Psychology of the Unconscious, says that by means of a flash of lightning, heroes are made immortal. And you're all thinking, well, yeah, Carl Jung, Tolkien, what's the connection? Tolkien quotes from Carl Jung on fairy stories from this particular book. So he'd clearly studied it. And perhaps something about the nature of lightning, Bilbo being seared of his petit bourgeois obsessions of handkerchiefs and walking sticks and waistcoats and so forth. I think that lightning requires a little bit of unpacking, if you like, a little bit of attention, a little bit of consideration, a little bit of interpretation, because it does seem to connect with these broader psychological theories. And then we get that whistle of the train. Tolkien, this has been criticized, but I think Tolkien is deliberately combining, clashing together images and ideas that are deliberately anachronistic. The more I've been looking at The Hobbit and also The Lord of the Rings, I see that Tolkien revels in contradiction and ambiguity and uncertainty and mixing these completely disparate elements together. And that's part of the attraction of the book. It's not to create a whole sort of seamless medievalist fantasy. It's to have lots of holes and gaps and problems that the reader can really explore and fall into or examine. So it's a deliberate anachronism. It wakes us up, or rather, it gets us thinking about how can these different elements all exist in the same story. Golf and guns and waistcoats. They're all in The Hobbit, along with goblins and giant eagles and dragons. And the Dwarves' song, when you look at that again, and we all know the wonderful version by Neil Finn in the Hobbit movie, about the Misty Mountains. It's actually a very well disguised limerick. It's a more nonsense verse. It's a series of limericks. You don't recite them as a limerick, but they are very much in the Edward Lear tradition. So it's a little sort of joke that Tolkien slipped in there. This very moving song is in fact a piece of Victorian nonsense verse. As we travel with Bilbo, we go beneath the Misty Mountains and to Mirkwood and the giant spiders. And I got interested in spiders because what giant spiders are there in culture before The Hobbit? Now, I'm hoping that somebody here will perhaps be able to tell me. I couldn't think of many, really. There's Arachne in Dante's Inferno, which is illustrated by Gustave Doré. You might want to mention the Martian tripods from the War of the Worlds in H.G. Wells. They're not really spiders, though. There's Lord Dunsany in The Fortress Unvanquishable Save for Sacknoth, and The Lord of Cities, and The Distressing Tale of Thangobrynd the Jeweller. Giant spiders in all of those, and certainly Tolkien read Dunsany, although we dismissed the last of those stories. They're only about that big, though, these spiders. I know if you're a hobbit that's that big, it's going to be quite large, but we're not talking about sort of a Shelob spider. And they're also quite humanoid. The Sacknoth, which is a sword, the spider in that is very loquacious. It's got a human face, it's got human hands. It starts weaving a noose and then runs away. In The Lord of Cities, the spider in that actually lives in a derelict city and says the only reason why men build cities is so they become dilapidated and spiders can then create art in them. So it's not exactly a Mirkwood spider, is it? And in Thangabrin the Jeweler, there's again a humanoid spider which has a giant jewel resting in on its lap. So these aren't really Mirkwood spiders. So where is Tolkien getting it from? Well, Little Miss Muffet. That, I'm afraid to say, I think is the source. Now, I'm not going to patronize you by showing you the Arthur Rackham image of Little Miss Muffet, but in fact, that's a much more convincing Mirkwood spider, quite spiky, terrifying, although it is wearing a top hat, I do admit. This was quite jaunty, but then this is for children. But we're dealing here again with the unexpected, the incongruous, with Tolkien deliberately mixing together unusual elements. Because spiders aren't really monstrous. Spiders are friendly, they're industrious, they're domestic helpers. To turn them monstrous, and I know that Michael Tolkien was an arachnophobe, and Tolkien liked putting spiders into things like Roverandom to tease him. But sort of Tolkien is, if you like, the laureate of the giant spider. And I think it's interesting to recognize how few giant spiders there are before we get to Mirkwood, or indeed to Shelob's lair. So this is sort of what I'm trying to do is to disturb some of the sort of internal consistency of these stories, to suggest that these unexpected elements are deliberately troubling or possibly teasing or even parodic. And another couple of examples from the beginning of The Lord of the Rings. I wonder whether you recognize this line. Hobbits? Well, what next? There's something mighty queer behind this. He was quite right, but he never found out any more about it. That's the fox. Where else do we come across a talking fox? This character is introduced as a talking fox. Yes, we've perhaps had talking wolves in The Hobbit. We've got talking spiders. But this character comes in, the narrator says, well, you never found out anything else about it. And then that's it. It's a deliberate but quite brilliant loose end. Tolkien is deliberately not tying these things together. He's showing you that there's actually more to Middle-earth than the story that he's telling. There are whole worlds of, fox life, if you like. These different things going on that are only touched on, that aren't really affected by the ring or the hobbits or Sauron. I mean, we're repeatedly told that Sauron is not the source of all evil. Carathras was cruel long before Sauron, for example. So Tolkien is interested in the limits of the story he's telling and what lies beyond those limits. Another, I think, more significant and controversial example of this would be Tom Bombadil, because Tom Bombadil is not explained within the story. That's why he's so troubling, or indeed annoying, to some quite influential readers. He's not contained within the story. He exists in another world. I mean, Gandalf has got this brilliant comment when they say, well, why don't you just give the ring to Bombadil? Well, he'll just lose it or throw it away. We've had 300 pages of terror and understanding the power of the ring, and then we meet somebody who doesn't care at all. Looks through it, puts it on, couldn't care less. So what Tolkien's doing is showing that his story is just part of Middle-earth. It's just a single strand, that there are unexplained and inexplicable things that lie beyond his particular narrative. I think that sort of capacity he has is very unusual. Most writers are seeking to close everything down. Tolkien's doing the opposite. He's trying to open everything up and leave these loose ends and unexplained aspects throughout his story. Now, As I read through The Hobbit the last time, I also noticed the black hart and the white hind in Mirkwood. Remember, the elves are hunting. They're hunting the white deer. And I thought, well, the white deer is an interesting figure. Now, you doubtless know about the Breton associations of the white deer in the lay of Outrue Itron, when it's ominous and represents bad luck. But in fact, in Germanic culture, it was a regal symbol. It was associated with the monarch. And that's why Richard II adopts the white hart as his badge, as any supporters of Tottenham Hotspur will recognize, because they still play at White Hart Lane, I believe. But Richard II taking the white hart as his badge is also itself rather ominous, because what happens to Richard II? Well, he's deposed by Henry Bolingbroke. He's a deposed king. There's a slight allusion then in The Hobbit to a deposed English king, and you're thinking, well, yeah, but Nick, it's only a very passing allusion, isn't it? It doesn't really matter that much. Until we get to Lake Town, when we come across another deposed king, James II. So the song that's sung about the return of the dwarves, the king shall come into his own, the return of the king, whose wealth shall flow in fountains and rivers, golden run, that refers to a Jacobite song when the king enjoys his own again. So the Jacobites were the supporters of James II, the last Roman Catholic king of England and Scotland. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? Roman Catholic monarch, who was deposed by William of Orange, William III, and his supporters were called Jacobites, and spent the next 50 plus years launching rebellions against the new dynasty before they were crushed at the Battle of Culloden. Now, is Tolkien really making a reference to the Jacobites in The Hobbit? Well, to be honest, I didn't really believe it until I came across a reference to Errantry, that strange poem, that Tom Bombadil poem, Errantry, that Bilbo rewrites as the tale of Eärendil when he's at Rivendell, which is actually based on I have no kith, I have no kin, which is another Jacobite song. Christopher Tolkien briefly refers to this in The History of Middle-earth. The first line is, oh, what's the rhyme to porringer? What he doesn't say is that by the third verse of this, the singer is calling for William III to be hanged and James to have his own again, King James, Jacobus, the Jacobite. So that's another reference. So I think the references begin to pile up. And who helps Bilbo finish this song in Rivendell? Aragorn. Aragorn is a returning king. So these are like private jokes. I think it's quite a feature of modernism, and people don't really talk about modernism with respect to Tolkien. People see Tolkien as being, a medievalist writer, part of a different tradition. He's using, Jungian psychology. He's using these sort of private references to political history in his writing. It's not that dissimilar to somebody like D.H. Lawrence, who uses Freudian psychology, or Ezra Pound, who uses his personal political references. Now, I want to turn now to the iconic object of The Hobbit, which is, of course, the Arkanstone. And something which I noticed about the Arkanstone is how it changes hands. It's worth emphasizing that it doesn't travel very far at all. unlike, in fact, the ring, which travels a very long way. But what happens? Well, Thrain discovers it. It's taken from him by Smaug, who is killed. It's then stolen by Bilbo, who lies about it. He then gives it to Bard, who returns it to the mountain. So there's a narrative arc to this iconic object. Let's just think about the ring. It's forged by Sauron, and it's taken from him forcibly by Isildur, who is then killed. You then get Gollum, who finds it and loses it, but then Bilbo, who finds it and lies about it, who gives it to Frodo, who returns it to the mountain. Admittedly, there's a bit of Gollum at the end there for the last sort of few seconds, but let's just circle it. My point is, these are almost exactly the same patterns. We do get Gollum appearing here, but Bilbo plays exactly the same role in each of these stories. He takes it and lies about it. And what I think is very interesting, particularly about The Hobbit, is how amoral Bilbo is. You know, he constantly lies and steals and deceives everybody else. He's still doing it in The Lord of the Rings, and Tolkien rather brilliantly incorporates his revisions into Bilbo's own lies. So really, what we're having here is a moral question about, first of all, the Arkanstone, because Bard quite reasonably says, is it yours to give? And Bilbo says, well, no. But Bard takes it anyway. So remember, this is a book for children. In fact, I've got a friend whose daughter stopped reading The Hobbit at that point because she thought that it was immoral. Admittedly, her father was an archbishop, so maybe she has a much more refined morality than some of us. But she recognized that Bilbo is a really problematic character. Okay, don't just think of him as a sort of hero who's sort of an aspirant hero who grows into some sort of like maturity. No, he lies and wheedles to the end. Think about how much stuff he steals. And that's why the Ring of Invisibility is so appropriate for him. What moral purpose does a Ring of Invisibility have? What morally can you do with it? Nothing. What it now allows you to do is to steal with impunity, to kill things unfairly. So we get Bilbo ransacking the larders of the Elven King, for example, or stealing in and out of the Dwarves' camp. So he's a really interesting figure. It's easy to simplify Bilbo, I think, as it is with many of Tolkien's characters. In fact, he's asking us questions about the pragmatics, about how we practically lead our lives and what decisions we make and how we can justify them. And with Bilbo, it's usually retrospective justification. And he knows, for example, that the Arkanstone isn't his 14th share. He's tried to convince himself. Like many of the hobbits, he has debates with himself. And we all know which hobbit has debates with himself the most, with split personality, with Smeagol, Gollum. But that's already there in Bilbo, I think. I know that it's not mine, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. And take it and then give it to you anyway. So that's one of the reasons I'm fascinated by these books, is that once you begin to sort of scratch these surfaces, they actually are much more suggestive and surprising than one might expect. Now, this brings me to, this really is a chestnut, the Balrog's wings. Does the Balrog have wings? And I'm only talking about the Lord of the Rings, so I'm not talking about the Silmarillion. But I hope that what I'm going to say is going to be slightly different to what some other people might have suggested. Now, Some of you will know the work of H.P. Lovecraft, the Call of Cthulhu, for example. Now, you may also be aware that Lovecraft has recently become the darling of a new philosophical movement called speculative realism or object-oriented ontology. And these philosophers, particularly Graham Harman, focus on Lovecraft because they see that Lovecraft is a rather exceptional writer. He's a unique writer. And one of the things that they're fascinated by with Lovecraft is his weird realism. The fact that he gathers together incongruities, contradictions, and these uncertain terms and phrases and piles them together in a way that doesn't fit and becomes impossible to paraphrase. So Lovecraft in the Call of Cthulhu says, if I say that my somewhat extravagant imagination yielded simultaneous pictures of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature, I shall not be unfaithful to the spirit of the thing, but it was a general outline of the whole which made it most shockingly frightful. So he's describing here this sort of strange statue of the great Cthulhu that's been discovered. And what Graham Harman says is that you can't really paraphrase this and say, well, it was a bit like an octopus, a dragon, and a human all rolled into one. You know, that's not what's going on here. Lovecraft is sort of extending these contradictions, which is sort of fair enough. But I think, in fact, that a better example is in M.R. James from the scrapbook of Canon Alberic, which was a story that Tolkien certainly knew and refers to in the fairy stories notes. So this is describing an illustration. At first you saw only a mass of coarse, matted black hair. Presently it was seen that this covered a body of fearful thinness, almost a skeleton, but with the muscles standing out like wires. The hands were of a dusky pallor, covered like the body with long, coarse hairs and hideously taloned. The eyes, touched in with a burning yellow, had intensely black pupils and were fixed upon the throned king with a look of beast-like hate. Well, fine, that's sort of so much horror, isn't it? But then you get to the killer. Imagine one of the awful bird-catching spiders of South America translated into human form and endowed with intelligence just less than human, and you will have some faint conception of the terror inspired by the appalling effigy. Now that to me is actually a much better example of what Graham Harman is talking about. So let's try, imagine one of the awful bird catching. So there are obviously lots of bird catching spiders, but you know, we're not natural historians, so we don't really know. We have a sense of what they might unfortunately look like. Translated into human form. Translation is how you describe the movement of holy relics. So there's something quite disturbing, quite sort of heretical about this. Endowed with intelligence just less than human. How can you imagine that? Endowed with an intelligence just less than human. And even then, you will only have some faint conception, so nothing accurate, and only then of the terror inspired by this appalling effigy. So this really is a horror that's escaping language, that's escaping representation, that's escaping description. And so that's what I think Tolkien is doing with the Balrog's Wings. It's imperceptible, it's vague, it's not distinct, it could not be seen. Okay, that's one of the first things we learn about it. It can't be seen, so how on earth can it be described? There's a great shadow, it's a dark form of man shape, maybe. That maybe is just brilliant, I think. It immediately introduces this whole sense of the uncertainty. As a streaming mane, a fiery shadow. The shadow reached out like two vast wings. So originally it's like two vast wings. But then the Balrog drew itself up to a great height and its wings were spread from wall to wall. So like wings then sort of coalesce into wings. You can't tell whether it's got wings or not. That's the point of this. it's both got wings and not got wings. Tolkien is describing something that can't be described, describing like an alien figure that exists outside of the reality of the characters that are experiencing it. It's both winged and unwinged simultaneously. I think that that's the strength of this passage. Okay, Tolkien is resisting that definition, and he's challenging us as readers to be able to see the thing in these two different ways. Now, in a different way, this sense of things being unresolved and never being fully explained, you can see as well in the rumors that fill the Lord of the Rings. There are rumors everywhere. And the rumor, for example, that Rohan are exporting horses to Mordor. Where does that rumor start? It actually starts with Gwaihir, the Wind Lord, the giant eagle. Surely the giant eagle should know better. Gwaihir tells it to Gandalf, who reports it at Rivendell. Aragorn and Boromir don't believe him. But then Gwaihir has said, so it is said. So again, you get this uncertainty. He's both telling you something and not telling you something at the same time. So you've got Gwaihir, Gandalf, Aragorn and Boromir are now in disagreement about it. Then Gimli repeats this to Éomer, and Éomer is the one who then angrily refutes it. So it takes 6 characters to actually establish the fact that this rumor isn't actually true. And it's a tiny example of the unreliability of information in The Lord of the Rings. For me, the most unreliable character, the least informed character, is actually Treebeard, who everybody thinks is formidably well-informed, who is very reliable. I'm glad to see that you shake your head there. He doesn't know about hobbits. You know, that's a major oversight, isn't it? You know, the hobbits aren't in his lists, which actually define the world for him. So that shows that these lists, that his account, that his perspective is limited. There's nothing wrong with a limited perspective. We all have a limited perspective. But Tolkien is drawing attention to how Treebeard's perspective is not whole. It's not absolute. As you probably know, Treebeard originally was going to be an evil character. So Tolkien had a very ambivalent attitude towards the animated trees. And I'd also add the fact that, you know, Treebeard, who says, well, we'll make Sauron suffer 7 times 9, I think, the number of years he made us suffer. 6 months! That's all he stays in Isengard for, before Treebeard lets him out. You know, and what's the consequence of that on the Shire? So Treebeard is a very unreliable character, and yet he's one of the most loved characters, I think, in the book. So again, Tolkien's interested in this ambivalence, in how, you know, we can maybe overlook the flaws in a character in order to embrace them and enjoy them and perhaps even understand them. But I think that Treebeard's sort of partial information is a real crucial problem in the book. And I think it's handled brilliantly by Tolkien. Another question would be the old man who appears at the fireside when Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli are approaching when they're chasing the Uruk-hai. And when they meet Gandalf, he said, well, it wasn't me. So therefore, is it Saruman? Well, Aragorn thinks it can't be Saruman because the horses weren't uneasy. So who is it then? It's not Gandalf and it's not Saruman. Well, I've been thinking about this because, of course, there are actually 2 Gandalfs. It's not Gandalf the White who's returned. And Tolkien in a note wrote, could it be a wraith of Saruman? Well, equally, could it be the ghost of Gandalf the Grey? The memory, the shared memory of Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, seeing the ghost of Gandalf the Grey for the last time before Gandalf the White appears before them. And interestingly, Gandalf the White, despite being the White, isn't exactly a very clear character. He speaks in riddles, and he's forgotten his own name. And he's also forgotten much of which he thought he knew. So again, Gandalf the White, as he re-emerges, is another very ambiguous, complex, troubling character. So what I want to get a sense of how sort of Tolkien's able to develop these difficult characters. None of them are simple characters. Not even Gwaihir, not even that big bird. You can't even trust him, not even a fox. There's multitude, there's sort of teeming lives going on, complications, difficulties behind all of these. Now, one of the things that I came across fairly recently was Jane Castell's interview with Tolkien. She was a graduate student of his. She became a science fiction writer. She interviewed him in the 1960s, and she asked him what he remembered about The Lord of the Rings. He said, well, there are two scenes which have stayed with me that particularly moved me. It's very interesting that a writer should talk about his work in the sort of third person like that. And for Tolkien, it was, as we all know, he was discovering the story rather than simply inventing it. And one of those scenes was the cock crowing. So the Lord of the Nazgul comes in through the gates of Minas Tirith. Gandalf in the first version says, "You cannot pass," which is what he says to the Balrog, remember, 3 times at the Bridge of Khazad-dûm, which he only says once in the film, and he says, "You shall not pass." It's terrible. But then in that sudden silence, a cock crows, caring nothing for battle or death, welcoming the morning, and at the same moment the horns of the Rise of Rohan are heard echoing on the sides of the mountains. And Tolkien found this very moving, even though he'd written it himself. He seemed to have touched something. He seemed to have sort of found a sort of a shared experience here. Well, part of the shared experience is Hamlet. The ghost of Hamlet's father fades on the crowing of the cock. Some say that ever against that season comes wherein our Saviour's birth is celebrated, the bird of dawning singeth all night long. And then they say, no spirit can walk abroad, the nights are wholesome. Then no planet strike, no fairy takes, nor witch hath power to charm, so hallowed and so gracious is the time. So this is a tradition that at the crowing of the cock at dawn, that's a time when ghosts return to their graves or to their tombs. But also a bit more than that. There's a tradition that the cock crowed all night long during the Nativity, that the cock was crowing when the angels sang to the shepherds, and also cock crow is the moment of resurrection. So this is deeply folkloric. It's also deeply Christian as an image, as a condensation, as a focus for this moment. It suggests a real shift. This is a turning of the tide. In other words, it's the cock crow is a turning of the tide because it introduces some 1,500 years of Christian folklore into the story. When this story was being told in the 4th century by Prudentius, the Roman Christian poet, for example. So it immediately extends. From one little allusion, you get this telescoping back 1,500 years and further to the Nativity of Christ. And perhaps inevitably, I'm going to talk about Shakespeare as my final example now. Tolkien appears to have an antipathy towards Shakespeare. appears to dismiss Shakespeare. One of his colleagues, Eric Stanley, once said to me, actually, I don't mind Hamlet, because I go and see it and I can never remember what happens. So it's always a great experience for me. So it's a typical medievalist dismissal of Shakespeare that, it doesn't really matter. They're just like silly stories, aren't they? But Tolkien does have a lot of Shakespeare in his writing. So the Crack of Doom itself, he admitted, was taken from Macbeth, where Banquo's line, stretch out to the crack of doom. Remember, it's seen in a mirror, which is not unlike Galadriel's mirror. And the crack of doom is actually the trumpet call. It's the peal of thunder at the end of time. Now, Tolkien turns this into a fissure in the rock. So he's playing on the word crack, okay? So it's a crevasse in the rock that only really becomes the crack of doom when it bursts, when it explodes, when it becomes a peal of thunder, when the ring is finally cast into it. So there is that nice conflation of meanings there. But to say it is in Macbeth, but Tolkien transforms it into a place. In The Merchant of Venice, we have all that glitters is not gold, which Tolkien turns around. It's also mentioned by Chaucer, of course. But this is how Gandalf describes Aragorn in the letter he leaves at the Prancing Pony. All that is gold does not glitter. So that's another sort of passing allusion there. But we also get sort of deeper a sense of identity. In Shakespearean tragedy, characters are always asking who they are. They really fear losing their identity. They really fear knowing who they really are. So King Lear says, "Who is it that can tell me who I am?" And his fool says, "Lear's shadow." So he's just a shadow of himself. Shadow also means actor at the time. And I think you get this throughout The Lord of the Rings. Aragorn, for a long time, isn't quite sure who he is. Many of the characters have multiple names. There's a sense of sort of shifting identities or unstable identities. Most obviously with Smeagol Gollum. But in fact, many of the major characters are either debating with themselves, unsure who they really are, and uncertain about their future. And despite what Tolkien himself said about disparaging Shakespeare, he lectured on Hamlet. He was also so moved by a performance of Hamlet in 1944 that he found the Ophelia scene almost unbearably poignant. So, he is actually much, much closer, I think, to that English literary tradition. Which perhaps brings us to the Ents again. Now, Tolkien said, well, the Ents just arrived in my story fully formed. They were a mixture of philology, literature, and life. The philology being from the Anglo-Saxon, the work of giants, Eald enter Yeowok. The literature being from his disappointment with Macbeth, saying that he had bitter disappointment and disgust from school days with the shabby use made in Shakespeare of the coming of great Burnham Wood to high Dunsinane Hill. I longed to devise a setting in which the trees really might really march to war. So there's an antagonistic inspiration here, thinking that Shakespeare should have made the trees walk, but in fact, he didn't. And yet, it still inspires him. And he refers to it. He knows where it's coming from. That's not the only source for the Ents. Gospel of St. Mark describes Jesus restoring a blind man to sight, who says, "I see men as trees walking." But then I came across Algernon Blackwood. I don't know if many people have read Blackwood here. the man whom the trees loved. Tolkien certainly knew Blackwood's stories. He cites them. They're in his bibliography. And this is somebody talking about the mysticism of a forest. And he talks about a great forest. Behind a great forest may stand a rather splendid entity. And he capitalizes it like that. That manifests through all the 1,000 individual trees. And this man also speculates that trees had once been moving things, animal organisms of some sort, that had stood so long feeding, sleeping, dreaming, or something in the same place that they had lost the power to get away. Now, that's exactly how Treebeard describes the Ents that have become tree-ish or sleepy. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that from the Shakespearean source of Macbeth, Tolkien's actually adding more and more layers. And another layer would, of course, be Arthur Rachman, who often has these tree spirits. He seems instinctively to want to animate trees in his pictures and then turn them into these sort of spiky, anthropomorphic spirits. Now, perhaps that's enough, really. Perhaps that's enough to explain where Tolkien got his Ents from. You're probably saying, yes, it is enough. But I'd also add that in 1932, one of Disney's silly symphonies was called Trees and Flowers. Anybody know about this? It's an award-winning short animation. It won the first Academy Award for such a production. And it is full, you can find it on YouTube, it is full of animated flowers and animated trees, and an evil tree that then sets fire to the forest. It tries to destroy the love between the male and female trees. It's characteristic because it's the first Disney animation to have a completely classical soundtrack, and the first to include a death, which is the evil tree who burns himself to cinders in the forest fire. So there's a lot behind the Ents. I'm not saying that Tolkien sat down and watched this. On the other hand, we know that he went to see Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, for example, and I think a landmark animation such as that he would have been aware of. Another couple of examples would be Éowyn. Éowyn, when she confronts the Witch King of Angmar, he has this charm of invulnerability. Know you're not that no living man can slay me. But then, I am no living man. That's obviously taken straight from Macbeth, who must not yield to when a woman born, but when Macduff is from his mother's womb, untimely ripped. And then Éowyn is thought to have died, and Prince Imrahil holds the vambrace, the armor on his wrist, to her lips and sees that her breath mists the vambrace. That's alluding to King Lear. When Cordelia has died, King Lear holds up a glass to her mouth in the hope that she's still breathing. And a character often overlooked, Eoreth, in the Houses of the Healing. Typical Shakespearean commentator. She's the low female commentator, very garrulous, also comments on Aragorn's coronation. Shakespeare is very fond of these characters who talk about the main action, the main characters, and provide this account of what's going on for the audience without having to describe the whole scene yourself. And finally, there's Frodo on the slopes of Mount Doom, who is like King Lear. King Lear is bound upon a wheel of fire, and Frodo feels like he's naked before the wheel of fire. So at those climactic moments, you get these Tolkien reaching out to these other writers, to these cultural touchstones, if you like. Now, all this makes me think that Tolkien has what Keats called negative capability. Keats is talking about Shakespeare, and he says that negative capability in a writer means that one who, being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, is without any irritable reaching out after fact and reason. Now, that for me is what Tolkien is superb at doing. He presents you with the problems, with the ambiguities, with the uncertainties, with the contradictions, but he doesn't then try to solve everything in that particular text. The joy of reading The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings is to live within those contradictions rather than to feel that everything has been neatly tied up for you by the author. So there's a love of the uncertainty, of the hesitancy, of the unexplained and the inexplicable. And this is what Tom Shippey says about the nature of providence and fate and evil, that Tolkien, combines the Boethian philosophy with Manichaeism, the duality of good and evil. He doesn't seek a solution. He just says these are two different ways of looking at the world, and sometimes one fits better than the other times the other one is more appropriate. So it's that acceptance of the limitations of making sense of things that I think we should enjoy. And so I'll just leave you on the top of Weathertop when Aragorn finds, or rather Aragorn tries to decipher a few scratches on a stone. I think even the most credulous reader is surely going to be skeptical about whether this really says Gandalf was here on the 3rd of October. It's only a few scratches. And Aragorn himself admits, well, the marks might mean something quite different and have nothing to do with us. There are more things in Middle-earth. Thank you. Now, I'm happy to take any questions if it's not too late.
There we go. Super. Well, thank you very much, Nick. Just to let you know that we've actually resolved the mystery of Balrog Wings.
Well, I thought you might have done, but I'm not offering another solution.
Well, there's only one solution which fits all the evidence, which is that actually Balrogs have wings, but they are vestigial. They're like giant penguins. It's the only explanation. Lynn.
I just want to come back in defence of Bilbo. He did give the emeralds to the Elf King to make up for stealing his food for all those weeks.
That's true. Yes, he does generously give those jewels to the Elf King. He feels some loyalty. He'd rather stand with the elves at the end of the battle, but he can't quite explain why.
He also says that it wouldn't be fair to kill Gollum.
Absolutely, and that's absolutely right. Yes, and then that becomes absolutely critical. So I think that is one of those really sort of interesting points where sort of Tolkien is able to see, he could kill him, but he doesn't. And you just wonder, well, would a lesser writer have just dispatched Gollum, got him out the way? I wonder about that. I think Tolkien wants to leave that end loose. He's not quite sure why, but as Gandalf says, he doesn't. Many who deserve to die don't, and so forth. But yes, he certainly has a chance to kill him, but he doesn't. It wouldn't be a fair fight, though he doesn't feel the same thing about the spiders. At all. He's quite happy to go, even though they are sentient and quite intelligent creatures, and they have language.
For anybody in the room, just make sure you wait for a mic to get to you, because the people on Zoom won't be able to hear you otherwise. Lynn.
I forgot what I was going to say.
Yes, Stefan?
You're talking at the end about sort of like dualism. You're thinking of Isildur, bad and not bad, because he's like good, and then he's not good. So he doesn't like square that circle, does he? And yet he's still a revered figure. And yet, if it wasn't for him,
Yes.
you know, Mr. Frodo, we wouldn't even be here.
I think that's a really, really good example, because, you know, throughout the Lord of the Rings, we're always, you know, as readers, we're encouraged to treat him as one of the great heroes of old. But he's so deeply flawed that, as you say, that's, you know, really it's a weakness of men, I think, as Elrond says, that has, you know, caused this whole problem. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good example. But then at the same time, he is constantly held up, and it's his line that is the royal line, that is the line that's going to reunite the kingdoms and, you know, afford some sort of deliverance.
I think you can see in Tolkien himself the same good and bad, because he's sitting writing these stories, and it's stream of consciousness. He's writing, and up pops Aragorn. You know, who's this chap in the corner? And you know, but at the same time, he puts in all these little things that he knows, and the loose ends. Good writers don't do that. They tidy everything up. He's not being a good writer. He's being naughty, just like his characters.
Yeah, well, funnily enough, Brian Sibley said that, you know, he wasn't a novelist because he's discovering the story as he goes along. And if you actually look at the process of how he wrote it, not only the amount of time it took, but the number of false starts and redrafts and rewritings and revisions and complete changes of tack and direction. It is somebody who is living the story in different ways, and that's the experience you get when you're reading it, which he managed to maintain. And I don't really know any other writers who've managed to achieve that, who have you living with the characters every step of the way, but also, I think, really importantly, experiencing the difficulty of the writing process. And one of the things to me is that The Lord of the Rings is about many things, but it's also about writing The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien is, you know, for example, when Frodo and Sam are in the Emyn Muil, Tolkien is looking for a direction, and he's not quite sure how he's going to get them out of there. And so they just wander around. They wander around as a sort of symbol of him looking for a way out.
Also, they need to waste a few days for the rest of the characters to catch up with the story.
Well, he's also very good at that, because, of course, he became absolutely meticulous in coming up with the chronicle, the tale of years, the day-by-day account. He became quite obsessed with things like phases of the moon and getting all that right. So you get what develops into a very strict time scheme, and yet within it there's a sort of chaos of possibility. But you do get these moments where, I mean, Tom Shipp has pointed this out, that characters are sort of saying, you know, oh, it's so many days since we did this, for example. And at the same time, you do get moments where they lose a sense of time, most notably in Lothlorien, but also, you know, Sam's always saying, you know, is it really the right time? You know, because, yeah, the days are wrong. You've got the great darkness, you've got the paths of the dead, for example. So there are still fluctuations within that. But he's fascinated by both the precision and the lack of clarity. And so I think there are very few writers, if any other writers, who actually sort of manage to balance that so effectively and to take the reader along in that way. If anybody's read Tom Jones by Henry Fielding, I mean, Tom Jones is that book is designed, it's like a pocket watch. You know, and he used calendars and phases of the moon to get everything exactly right. You do sort of feel that the whole thing is, you know, beautifully arranged. Tolkien has that, but at the same time, he also has this level of uncertainty as well. And, you know, you both, again, it's like the Balrog Wings, forgive me, they're both there and not there. You know what day it is, but also at the same time, you don't.
Cool. We've got a hand up online from John.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you, John.
Oh, lovely, thank you. Okay, yeah, no, I just wanted to ask. Well, I thought your comment about ambiguity was brilliant. Something that always I got obsessed about when I was kind of rereading it and also reading all the appendices is that obviously the biggest character in the Lord of the Rings is the one that we never meet, which is Sauron. And there's always this argument: would Sauron have looked like had someone met? Had we seen him in the story? And obviously, in the film, Peter Jackson makes the choice that Sauron is a big fiery eye, which for me doesn't work. But that's just personal taste. But I thought that was another one of those kind of ambiguities, because Gollum makes a reference to him only having 4 fingers, doesn't he, when he describes him? And I just wondered what you thought about this, if that, the notion of Sauron's physicality in the Third Age was ever something that kind of challenged your, kind of what is, is this another one of Tolkien's conundrums?
Thank you. That's a really nice point. And I think you're absolutely right that, we don't come face to face with Sauron. Of course, Pippin arguably does. Does Denethor, Saruman presumably, but this the sort of the intangibility of Sauron, I think, is an important aspect of this general quality of ambiguity. But I'd also say that my earlier point about Sauron not being the source of all evil, that even Gollum says that Sauron isn't all-powerful. When they're going across the Dead Marsh, he says even, Sauron can't see everything yet. So there is a sense to the limitation of Sauron's powers, which on the one hand is being held up as this sort of implacable force of evil that is sort of crushing everything before it. On the other hand, he's not only not all-powerful, he doesn't have that omnipotence, but he also makes serious errors. When Aragorn challenges him in the Palantir, it forces Sauron's hand, and he deploys his army too soon. The Great Darkness lifts too soon. He seems to make a series of strategic errors. He doesn't win a significant battle. He wins the minor battles which we're told about, but the major battles he loses. So it turns out that he's much more fallible. And that, I think, sort of undercuts this demonization of him. He turns out to be, like the other characters in the book, a character with his strengths and weaknesses, rather than just being this impersonal force. I mean, if I had sort of, world enough and time, as people have said, it's interesting to look at Sauron when he's on Numenor. And you can sort of see the development of his character a little bit more there. He does seem to have become somehow dematerialized in The Lord of the Rings, but at the same time, he hasn't assumed an absolute superiority, I don't think, and he can still be challenged, combated, misled, let's face it, and deceived. I mean, the whole of the subplot is a gigantic misdirection. You're getting once Pippin and Merry have been taken by the orcs, that becomes a pretext for a whole series of subplots that distract attention from Frodo and Sam, who are sort of creeping towards Mount Doom, and then it proliferates into even more subplots. So you get, Pippin and Gandalf, and Merry and Rohan, and the Paths of the Dead, before they all come back together again. But they're all really just exercises. They're all just decoys to try to draw Sauron's attention away from what he should be doing and which he can't conceive, which is that the ring might be destroyed. But thank you very much. That's a great question. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
I'm just coming back to Lynn's point about Tolkien not tying up the loose ends. And you may say he's not being a good writer, but he's being realistic.
Yeah.
You get incidents like Glorfindel turning up, and then you never see your tell of him again, and people say, well, what was the point of him being there? But things like that happen in life. You meet somebody, you fall into conversation with them, you get on like a house on fire, and then you never set eyes on them again. And you contrast that with Sir Walter Scott, who writes a cracking good story once he gets going, but at the end he will tie up every little loose end, and he will tell you what has happened to every minor character after the book finished, down to their children and grandchildren sometimes.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and that's That's why I think Tolkien is so good, because he deliberately leaves those loose ends loose. And let's face it, Shakespeare did the same. You know, critics have spent decades arguing about what happens to this or that character. Well, the point is, as you say, it's real life. People come and go, and you don't need to know the life history of everybody to put them into a plot. That the whole, you know, the quality of their appearance, of their coming and going, is their being there at that particular moment, and the unexpected influence they might have on the course of events. It's not the fact that they are contained within some, you know, brilliantly organized plot structure. It's the fact that the plot is actually sprawling and doesn't have an end to it. You know, as we've heard several times, you know, the great tales don't have an end.
Any more for any more? I mean, I'm massively curious about how we're going to rewrite Little Miss Muffet.
If you can find a giant spider earlier than
That sat down beside her.
the Dunsany ones, and the Arthur Rackham, I'd like to know.
Curds and whey bread, indeed. Are there any more hands up online? Okay, in which case I would like to thank you very, very much, Nick, for a very, very thoughtful talk. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.